So good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Watson. I'm one of our ag agents here in Washington County. And tonight we're going to be talking about seed saving. And to me, seed saving is sometimes unfamiliar to some gardeners, and I don't think it should be. It's not something that requires decades of gardening experience or anything sophisticated to do it successfully. Basically, just takes a desire. And so tonight, I do hope I'll introduce it to you if it's something new or if it's something you've been doing for a while, maybe give you some more ideas. If I mention trade names, brand names, sources for products, anything like that, please understand that neither myself nor the University of Tennessee are endorsing those products, and nor are we implying any disapproval for something that I don't mention but is of similar nature. Additionally, if I talk about any pesticides this evening, make sure you read and follow all label instructions, and nothing that I say tonight trumps that label. The label is the law, and we must always follow that. So I do want to take a moment to say that I want to specifically encourage you to save seed in your garden. I think honestly, saving seed can be a lot of fun for us. And so I want to make sure I say this because this presentation has a lot of technical information. And the reason I'm bringing you that technical information is because there is a somewhat right and wrong way to do seed saving if you are trying to be very specifically true to type, or if you want to make absolutely certain or as near certain as possible that you're not going to have off type seeds being produced, then there's some very specific things we should do. There's some good rule of thumbs that are great for the garden, and at a commercial level, they take things even to a more higher rigid standard. But what I want to encourage you as a gardener is just try saving some seeds this year. Worst case scenario, if you don't worry about pollination distances and isolation distances and things like that, you might get something crossed that you didn't expect. It's not a bad thing. Sometimes surprises are good. So don't let any of the technical side of this tonight scare you away from doing it. That's not to say we can't do it and be a little more lax. Just understand what might come with it. For me, if you've got kids, this is a flower you should be growing. Balsam or impatiens or touch-me-nots is a common name. The neat things about these is the seed pods you see there in the left picture, when they're getting ripe, when those seeds are getting mature, if you touch them, they actually spring open. So they're actually under pressure and actually will throw the seeds. So those seeds get catapulted. And so for kids in the garden, this is something that can be a lot of fun with it. And it's not a bad looking flower either. So touch-me-not, sometimes called jumping betties as well, or balsam impatiens, is one that I think we can certainly have a lot of fun with, maybe more so than some of the others. But things like this, I think, makes seed saving interesting and different. One thing to understand about seed saving is we do sometimes end up with crosses or things happening. And part of that comes down to the complexity that is out there with some crops. And so here's just a picture of a bunch of different ornamental gourds and some pumpkins. And the thing to understand about cucurbits is we actually grow three different species, or can grow three different species in our garden. With most of what we grow are actually the Cucurbita pepo. And what that means is things like acorn and delicata squash, most gourds, pumpkins, zucchini, etc., those can all cross-pollinate with each other. Now, it's not going to affect this year's fruit, so we can grow them all in the garden at the same time. And even if it is a yellow squash pollen that is pollinating our pumpkin flower, doesn't mean we're going to get a pumpkin squash cross in that fruit, because on cucurbits, the fruit that we see, the thing that holds the seeds, is actually maternal tissue. That's why if you look closely at the flowers of cucurbits, you see what looks like a little squash basically behind the flower parts. That is that maternal tissue that forms the fruit, but it's the ovules that become the seeds inside that are the recombination of DNA from the pollen and from the ovules. So we don't actually get a crossed fruit this year. If we get that cross pollination and we plant it next year, that's when we see those crosses come up. And honestly, with gourds and things like that, sometimes that can be actually fun to see what happens, because you can start out with different shapes, sizes, and colors. start saving seed from those, and you end up with weird, unusual, different things that you hadn't seen before in your garden. So that's also, I think, part of the fun of saving seeds is you can have crosses, and that can actually be part of the fun. So we'll talk about what seeds we should be saving in our garden. We'll talk a little bit, just very briefly, about growing for seed saving. We'll talk a little bit about processing seeds. How do we go from that fruit, which is to say the thing holding the seeds, to seeds that we have for replanting? And then we'll even mention storage of seeds because we want to make sure we give these the longest life possible. We are going to focus on vegetables tonight, but truthfully, the principles apply absolutely to ornamentals, even tree fruits or whatever. It's just we're focusing mainly on vegetables for the specifics. One of the big things with seed production, just like anything else we're trying to harvest, we have our best harvest from the healthiest plants. And so that means that to have good seed, we need to have plants that have sufficient fertility. We're doing irrigation, but we're not getting the plants wet, so we're minimizing leaf wetness so we don't have disease problems. We look at the timing of our plantings, and there can be more than one reason for that. We don't want to plant things out too early or too late because we may not get a lot of growth before they start flowering. We want to think about rotation of crop families to reduce disease pressure. We may be using pesticides in the garden specifically to help us have the most healthy plants possible. And then lastly, there are some seed treatments that we can actually use to kill some pathogens. A lot of home growers don't necessarily use these a lot, and that's not a bad thing, but there are some options that we might be able to do if needed. Some very basic botany, because this kind of gives us the guide of why we do the activities we do related to seed saving. So where do seeds come from? Seeds are a result of sexual reproduction. And what we have is the transfer of pollen from the anthers to the pistil. And then eventually it grows a pollen tube down into the ovules where they become fertilized. And that is actually what becomes our actual individual seeds. So that pollen can come from more than one source. And what I mean by that, we have here what is regarded as a perfect flower, meaning it has both male and female parts. We also have plants that don't have flowers that look like this. So cucurbits, I mentioned them earlier, all our squashes and etc. The female and male flowers are on the same plant, but they are actually separated. So the female flowers do not have male parts and the male flowers do not have female parts. So in some plants, we have them on the same plant, but separated. We have some plants, again, not so much in our vegetable species, but certainly across woody plants, we have sometimes male and female specimens where a tree may actually be male or female and only have one flower type. So we do have some different scenarios, but mostly in our garden, we have them at least on the same plant, if not within the same flower. And so where seeds come from is basically that act of pollination. And so you get the anther producing pollen, and that pollen goes to the pistil. When we're looking at plants, there's a few things we need to understand. The big thing is what we're seeing, the characteristics that we observe. That's what we would refer to as the phenotype when it comes to genetics. And don't worry, we're not going to go deep into genetics. I certainly wouldn't be the person to do that. That's not my background at all. But what we understand is that phenotype is what we see. That is a function of not only the genes that are present within that plant, but also the environment. And that's a really important part. Because what this means is not everything we see happening is going to get passed on to that next generation. So any given year, you may have a particular plant in the garden that is bigger or smaller or produces great or doesn't produce great or whatever. That's not necessarily to say that the seed we would save from that plant is going to give us those same exact characteristics, because that physical presentation that we see, the genes are only part of it, and the other part is environment. And so sometimes this can disappoint people because they think, well, if I have a really great plant this year and I save those seeds, that's what's going to happen moving forward. Not always the case. And so just understand there are limitations on what we can observe and expect to pass on. We hope to get maybe some of those positive things we see, but it's not going to happen every time that everything we see is carried on, because it does have that environmental factor that has a significant part of what happens. We need to understand if we're growing for seed, we are harvesting at a very different time than if we're growing for basically market or culinary use. So we can think of horticultural or market maturity as being when we harvest things when we want to eat them. And so here is an excellent depiction. We've got our cucumbers we'd be harvesting, happy to see in the kitchen or on our plate. And then to the right of those, we see the one that gets hidden behind some leaves, gets ginormously large, and if we wait long enough, it gets yellow. We wouldn't be happy if that was what was on our plate, probably. And the reality is, when we are looking for seed saving, it is those large, overgrown yellow cucumbers that we're actually trying to seek out, because those are actually reaching physiological or seed maturity. So basically, we're just allowing that fruit to continue to grow until those seeds have actually matured. So just understand, we don't harvest things at the same time. That doesn't mean sometimes there's not some overlap, where when we harvest for culinary use, we could also get seeds that are mature. But by and large, we are harvesting later purposely to allow those seeds to reach maturity. When it comes to seed, there's the big question of what seeds should we save? Basically, we can classify plants into two broad categories, and that would be open pollinated and hybrid. We sometimes see open pollinated replaced by the word heirloom. And there actually are heirloom hybrids at this point in time, just depending how far back you want to go, because hybrids are not new. And so what we generally recommend you save is open pollinated plants. Okay, and so why is that? So open pollination is just to say that we are producing seed that doesn't have controlled pollination. And so basically, you just have these plants planted out, and whether they're pollinated by wind or by insects, we just plant the same variety together, and the pollination happens basically through natural means. And when these plants are self-pollinated or pollinated by a plant of the same variety, then we would expect that the seed it produces will produce plants that look like the parents. So it would stay true to type, or we would see things that will produce what the parents were. In a sense, we're saying that these are kind of genetically inbred, in that they don't have a broad genetic base. And we'll kind of rein that in a little bit later. But for now, just think of these as being a little bit more inbred, in that they're not outcrossed. And I will say, inbreeding in this case actually doesn't really have a negative connotation, because what we're doing is we are actually limiting that genetic base so that we have the characteristics we want. So it's not an accidental or unintentional limiting. It's actually to make sure that we get the characteristics we're looking for. Hybrids, on the other hand, do have a controlled pollination happening. So what we have is we have two parental lines. And so we have mom and dad, if you will, and dad is the pollen source. Mom is the ovule, the seed plant itself. And so we have specific characteristics related to each one of those. And then we have the seed that's created is an F1. So sometimes you will see in catalogs and elsewhere hybrids referenced as F1. That's just saying it is a cross of two parental lines. And if we plant that seed, we're going to get a plant of specific characteristics, some coming from both parents, but it's not going to look exactly like either parent. It's actually going to be a combination. If we allow that F1 generation to cross-pollinate itself, or a group of the same variety to cross-pollinate, we get what's referred to as an F2 generation. The problem with the F2 generation is it has a very genetic makeup. So in this case, it could look like the F1. It could look like either of the parental lines that created the F1, or it could look like something completely different. Essentially, the characteristics of that F2 seed when it grows out isn't really known. It's unpredictable. And so this is why we don't save hybrid seeds. You're not necessarily going to get a plant that has the characteristics you want because it has such a broad genetic makeup. There's a lot of possibility that you'll get a plant that's bigger or smaller, or fruit that's better or worse. There's just a big question mark. And it's that unpredictability is why we say don't save hybrid seeds. So I've been talking a lot about pollination. And so when we talk about open pollinated plants, for them to remain true to type, you have to prevent cross-pollination from another variety or even a related species of plant. So the way we do this is we got to start out thinking about, okay, what's the primary pollination method for a particular plant? We have a few options. Essentially, there's insects, there's wind, or there's self-pollinating. And so self-pollinators are ones that are not aided directly by wind or pollination. And so we'll talk about what that really means. But basically, there's not an outside introduction of pollen from another flower. One way we can prevent unwanted pollination is by only growing a single type of vegetable. And then we just simply don't have unwanted pollen around. The challenge becomes, where else could pollen come from? So if we have neighbors that have gardens, or even if we have wild species that can cross, we might have a problem. So let's say we're trying to grow carrot seed, and let's say none of our neighbors have a garden, so we think we're doing okay. But maybe there's some weedy fence rows within a reasonable distance from our garden. If there happens to be some Queen Anne's lace flowers in there, we might have a problem suddenly, because Queen Anne's lace is actually a wild carrot. And so if pollen was moved by insects from Queen Anne's lace to our carrot, we could suddenly have a carrot that didn't have the characteristics we wanted. It was more like Queen Anne's lace, which doesn't have a nice root that we'd be happy eating. And so because of that, we do have to think sometimes about what weeds might be present that might be able to cross-pollinate. We can also think about the timing of pollination or flowering. And so we can sometimes grow more than one type, even if we're wanting to save seeds and be very strict about pollination, just by looking at days to maturity. So sometimes we can have short or long season crops within the same variety of vegetable. And so by planting those at the same time, for instance, one might flower quite a bit earlier than the other. And so when we do that, we're separating the pollination events by time. And that means we don't have cross-pollination, or we're less likely to see it happen. This doesn't work well with things that have a very long bloom period, or that bloom and produce over the length of the season, for instance. But certainly for corn, which has a very defined blooming period and pollen shedding period, it works well. Isolation by distance. And so this one, as obviously it infers, we're looking at separating things. And so this is the primary method for commercial certified seed production. They simply don't have a pollen source nearby. And so this is a really useful tool for those things that are self-pollinating, because we can have very small distances between different varieties of self-pollinators, because self-pollinators are unlikely to have pollen moved from one plant to another. And so they have very short distances that I think are very realistic for home gardeners. Those that are pollinated by wind and those that are pollinated by insects do have further distances. Lastly, we have the ability to consider isolating by physical means. And so that means that we know there's a potential cross-pollination source nearby. So what we do is we protect the flowers, we cover them. There's different ways we can do this. We can use everything from floating row covers. Breeders will oftentimes, if they're breeding like varieties of corn, they'll use paper bags that they place over the ear and staple. You can tape blossoms shut. For instance, on squashes, they'll be taped the evening before they would open so that the female flowers do not open, and so they're not available for insects to pollinate. But the problem is everything I just described of blocking pollinator access means you have to be the pollinator. And so that means you have to find the male flower, the pollen sources. You have to use that to then go to the female flower and pollinate yourself. Now, this is what breeders do, whether they're doing it in a greenhouse or in a field. This is how professional breeders do it. They actually isolate those flowers and then they will pollinate themselves. So it does work. It has labor, has expense of some materials, but it is highly effective at limiting what pollination happens. So if you have a variety that's very important to you, that you want to keep it as pure as possible, this might be a method you would use on a limited basis. Or maybe you do want to try breeding your own variety, crossing two things and seeing what happens. This would be a great way to do that. There's also some strategies that we have to be aware of that work really well unless there's something odd going on. And so let's say we have a very severe drought. And because of that, a lot of our wildflowers that we would normally see simply aren't there. They're not blooming. We might have flowers that we ordinarily wouldn't see insect visitors at being visited. So things like peas and beans, which are not highly attractive to most insects, might suddenly see an uptick in insect visitors simply because there's not reliable food sources otherwise available to the insects. It's not a common problem that we see, but there are scenarios where it could happen. So just be aware of that we might be a little more stringent on some things if we had something like this happen. So just understand there are scenarios where a flower that's not super attractive might become more attractive if floral resources become very limited. One way we can have a little bit of insurance is to actually plant our plants in blocks, not in rows. And so what do I mean by that? So if we were planting corn, we always want to plant in blocks. So rather than planting a 100-foot row, I would tell you plant 4 25-foot rows or 5 20-foot rows, because as wind pollinated, where they shed the pollen at the top of the plant on the tassel, we don't want a long, narrow row. We want a block of pollen moving around. Well, we can kind of take the same idea, and if we have a block, that center is being extra isolated from any outside pollen source. So in the picture you have there where you have the planting, you have the rows, the red would be those areas where we would want to harvest seed from. The yellow being the surrounding rows and growing area that we don't. And the thought being that if it's a wind pollinated plant, those outer rows are going to catch most of that wind-borne pollen from outside of that crop. If they're insect, the same ideal. By the time they get into those interior rows, hopefully they visited the yellow rows first, and the pollen that is being deposited or moved is from the yellow rows. And so that's all the same variety. It's just we're only harvesting from the center, again, to kind of give a buffer zone around that seed crop. Another thing we can do is if we have multiple varieties growing, we can try to harvest seed from the peak bloom of that variety. So again, we do have varieties that bloom early, mid, or late on any of the given variety of vegetables. And so we can actually make a point to harvest from the peak bloom period of that specific variety, whichever period it may be. Doesn't mean it's 100% ensured that we won't have cross-pollination, but if the correct pollen is most abundant during that period, then we're most likely to have the best outcome. The good thing is we have some very friendly vegetables or easy vegetables to start saving seed from. So peas, beans, tomatoes, and lettuce are excellent for beginners. So why is that? All of them are self-pollinators. meaning they have very short isolation distances. So if we're trying to be careful, if we're wanting to be sure not to have cross-pollination, we have very reasonable distances to isolate. So that means we actually do it in the home garden. We don't need acres and acres of fields. All of these are annuals. So that means that we don't have to deal with biennial plants, which flower in the second year. That makes things simpler. Any of these can be grown in small areas. A number of them do very well with trellising, such as beans, peas, and even tomatoes can be trained upward. So we don't have to have a large garden area. And certainly they all work well in our climate. Now, again, if we are wanting to ensure purity and we're wanting to be real careful about this, then we do want to pay attention to some isolation distances. If you're just a home gardener and you're truthfully just not wanting to rebuy seed every single year, that may not be as big a deal to you. So don't think that just because you have it in the past or you're not sure you'll have the space to do it this year to do the perfect isolation distance that you shouldn't save seeds from these. Again, the worst case scenario that happens is you save seed next year when you plant it, it grows out and it's not what you expected. It might mean you have to buy something from a local farmer's market, but that's certainly not too terrible of a price to pay. So one thing I want to encourage you, if you are saving seed, is try not to save a single fruit or seed from a single plant. And so, I have heard sometimes where people will say, I always save seed from the very first tomato to be ripe. That's great, but we never know if we're just saving from a single fruit. We're basically just saving from a single mother plant. And remember I said earlier that open pollinated plants are inbred to a certain extent. It is only to a certain extent. So anytime we start narrowing that base genetic availability by saving just one mother plant, we are limiting the genetics even further. And so I would always encourage you to try to save seed from multiple plants. In fact, in some of the guidelines we're going to touch on, they will actually give some specific numbers from the number of plants you should be sourcing seed from to try to keep as broad a genetic basis as possible. But certainly, saving seed from multiple fruits, from multiple plants, make sure you're capturing all of those genetics that you are seeing. The scary thing is, if you're only saving that first tomato that gets ripe, you may be selecting, let's say, for early production, but you may be giving up something else, whether it's overall yield capacity or disease resistance or something else. You never know what may have been selected out by selecting for a single characteristic. So always try to have a broad genetic basis for the seed you're saving. Good thing is, and I said we're focusing on vegetables tonight, flowers also give us the ability to save seeds. So certainly you see there on your screen a bunch. We actually have a really good publication, I think. It's Plants for Tennessee Landscapes, Seed-Grown Flowers for the Garden. We can find some of the easiest plants to save seed from because they do a really good job themselves with seed. So if you see a plant described as a self-sower or as a reseeder, well, it will come back each year just from the seed it's produced. Chances are it's going to be easy for us to save seed and have a success with it. So you see there a number of those on your screen, and there are others as well, but all of those are fairly reliable, easily collected and saved, and do well for us. So if we want some specifics of those suggested crops, peas, for instance, peas have a minimum isolation distance of only 10 feet. So we can have varieties of peas that are 10 feet apart and be perfectly good for our home gardens. And I will say these distances are adapted down from what is recommended from commercial certification, for instance, but it's still a reasonable distance. And so, you'll see some that might be a little bit larger, but certainly 10 feet is worthwhile in the home garden to look at that. And it's talking about a minimum population size of 10 to 20 plants. And so that doesn't mean we have to save all the seed from 10 plants, but if we save 1 or 2 pods from 10 different plants, that might be what we do instead of saving all from one plant. With beans, with Phaseolus vulgaris, which is to say the common green bean, what most of our green beans are soup beans, etc. We're looking at 10 feet. Peas and beans are cousin to each other. They have physically similar blossoms, and so we have the same isolation distance, and again, population size the same. One thing to understand about beans is we do grow other beans that are different species, or in some cases, even different genuses. So you see there runner beans and lima beans. While they are the Phaseolus, they are not vulgaris. And so being different species, they actually have different requirements. So runner beans, which are less commonly grown, but certainly they can be grown in our gardens, both as a vegetable, but also as an ornamental. They have larger blossoms, and so sometimes we find them grown as ornamentals. They actually have a much larger isolation distance because they're more likely to be insect pollinated. Lima beans, again, we see a larger distance because of those differences compared to our common garden bean. And cowpea or asparagus bean, it's actually a completely different species and genus both. So there again, we see a larger distance, but what's great is you could have your green beans mixed with runner beans, mixed with lima beans, and mixed with cowpeas all in the same row because they're all not going to cross-pollinate each other. So although they're all beans to us, being that they're different species and being that they're even a different genus, they're not going to cross-pollinate one another. And so there are occurrences in the plant world where we can have species that do cross-pollinate, but we wouldn't expect that these would do that. And so that makes it a little bit safer. We can have some of these put in as spacers if we were growing all of them. Lettuce is one that has a very small isolation distance again. So this is one, if you have lettuce that you're growing in the spring, we get to the warmer weather, it starts to bolt or flower. If we let that happen, we can actually save seed off of it. And so if you don't have your lettuces mixed together, you could be reasonably assured if they're 10 feet apart that we're going to have fairly true to type seed produced. And again, not a large population size required. One thing to be aware of with lettuce is we can have a weed in the garden. That's a wild lettuce. So if you kind of ever see a tall dandelion, because dandelions don't grow upright, but if you see those kind of dandelion-like leaves and yellow flowers, you may be looking at wild lettuce. And so wild lettuce can, in fact, pollinate our garden lettuces. And because of that, we would want to make sure we don't have those within the given area of 10 feet for certain. Wrong way. Tomatoes are slightly more complicated, and it's not too complicated, but there is a big difference in the types of tomatoes we grow. So it all comes back to the female part of the flower, the style or the pistil, and whether it extends out where we can see it visibly or not. So in most modern tomatoes, we do not see that style or pistil sticking out of the flower. Older varieties, we often see what is called an exserted style. Again, we can call that a pistil as well, meaning that it extends beyond the anther cones. It sticks out. We also see in many cherry tomatoes and currant tomatoes where we have that style protruding outwards again. And so why is this important? So here's a picture example that hopefully makes it a little clearer for you. On the left, we see the modern tomato flower. What you see there is you really don't see anthers or style either one. They're self-contained within that blossom. And what that means is the likelihood of windborne pollen, for instance, landing on that flower is virtually none. The likelihood that an insect is going to be pollinating that, because essentially there is no access to the pollen or nectar that it would be producing, is none. And because of that, it's self-pollinating. So those modern self-pollinating non-extended pistils or styles basically have very low thresholds for isolation. we see in the excerpt. And if you look at the tip of those flowers, you see the anthers and then the kind of like green tip in the center. If it was a real clear picture, we'd see it's kind of triangular in shape, but that pistil or style is actually sticking out. So one, it is out there in the air, or certainly if there was pollen on the air, it could land. It's out there where an insect can interact with it or the anthers and transfer pollen that way. So because of that, we have more concerns if they have the extended style. So basically, we do have to look at the flowers of tomatoes to see exactly what sort of distance we might consider. And so for modern flowering varieties, those that have the non-extended styles, we're looking at 10 feet. And again, 10 to 20 on the population size. For the heirloom or extended styles, we're seeing 40 feet. Again, because we are more concerned that cross-pollination might happen. Now, certainly, again, in the home garden, we may not worry about this too much. But if we have a heirloom tomato that's been passed down in our family, we may want to pay closer attention to this if it's not as simple as just ordering more seed next year. If our red tomato certainly turns yellow on us, so for instance, because of cross-pollination. But you can see there, again, there is a difference depending on that flower type. So what about harvesting seed? So again, we're going to wait until that fruit, the part that holds the seed, reaches physiological maturity, and we have ripe seed, so to speak. So let me go back. So on tomatoes, we are looking for them to get full color, even start softening on the plant. We don't need them to rot on the plant. We don't need to take it that far, but certainly we want to see them reach full color and start getting a little bit soft. It's not uncommon that we'll pick tomatoes maybe before they're fully ripe and let them sit on the kitchen counter or even on a sunny window to finish up coloring. We don't want to do that if we're saving seed. We want to keep them on the plant as long as possible so they get the full maturity while on that plant. The picture of the lettuce seed here, this is one that's very mature because when the lettuce goes to seed, we get these puffy little flying seeds, not too dissimilar from dandelions in a manner of speaking, same ideal. And so when we see them like that, where they're already very fluffy and probably already moving on us, we probably were a day later than we may have should have been. But certainly we'll see them get ready and start to shed in that manner. With beans, for instance, let's say we were growing soup beans. So, certainly green beans, we pick immature whenever we're cooking them. Soup beans, we want that bean to be mature. But if you look to the right, you see the pods or the actual legumes of bean plants, they've started drying down. And so we can actually see on the left where we still have a little greenish yellow color to the pod, but on the right, they've actually started drying down. Now we can do this indoors. We can actually pull up plants whenever they start getting close to maturity or drying down and let them dry down indoors. There are times when we have very wet weather when it's advantageous to do that even. We don't have to leave them on the plant to dry down. But we do want them to be certainly to the soup bean stage where we have fully developed beans and those pods are no longer green. They're starting to yellow and turn colors at minimum. When we're talking about processing seed with lettuce, what's great about it is we can actually collect seed over multiple days. And so as we start seeing the earliest flowers starting to reach that seed maturity, we can just take like a paper bag, put it over the head of the lettuce and just kind of shake it. And those seed that are mature will basically fall out into the bag. We could also, when a good portion of that seed head has reached maturity, just go ahead and harvest the entire seed head and let it hang in a bag for a few days and let it start drying out. We can easily remove all the fluff or feathers from the seed just by rubbing it in our palms. We can also use like screens or sieves to further clean the seed and actually run it through those. We do like to dry seeds completely. It's extremely important we do this. We don't want to actually do this out in the sun. And we also don't want to do this at a high temperature. So we're typically not using any heat source. We don't want to stick them in a hot car in the summer, for instance, or something like that. Just ambient indoor conditions. If we have air conditioning where we have drier air, that just kind of as a help complete its job a little bit faster. We sometimes will keep things in a bag, and that's fine, but just kind of shake the bag daily to make sure that we don't have clumps forming, that we don't have wet stain on the bottom, for instance, and that we get good even drying in that container. Beans, whenever those individual pods do mature and begin to dry down, start that yellowing process, we can uproot the plant or we can selectively pull those. It's whichever works best for us. When we have those pods dry, when they start being able to be cracked apart, then we know we can get those beans out in any number of ways. We can put them in a pillowcase, run it in a no heat dryer cycle with tennis balls in the dryer to break that up. We can physically step or walk on a bag that has those pods in it. They're not too hard to break apart, but definitely it's going to take some physical process of some kind to do that. Once we have them out of that and separated from the pod pieces, we do again want them to dry in a warm, dry place, but again, not in the sun. So ambient conditions indoors generally is great for any of these seeds for their finished drying. And again, if we have them in a container, keep it stirred, keep it shook up so that we don't get differing moisture layers happening. So tomatoes, there is a technical and way to do this with fermentation. And so what we do is we take our ripe fruit, we scoop out the seeds, throw it in a container, and we add water. We then basically let it ferment for about 48 hours. We may stir it a few times each day. Once we stop seeing bubbles, we basically will add more water and stir again. And what happens is we'll have seeds settling on the bottom. Anything that's floating is not good seed. So our good seed is settled to the bottom. So we pour off the water and anything that's floating, and we basically add more water, stir it up again. And we do that several times, allowing the seed to settle to the bottom each time. And by doing that, we end up with good, clean seed. We dry those out on a flat surface, out of the sun, warm area again. So things like wax paper is good because it helps prevent the seed from sticking to the surface. So if we use paper towels or something like that, in this scenario, we could have seed really stuck to a paper towel and hard to separate. So this is the way that professionally seeds are done. If you're selling to a seed company, for instance, you'd be doing fermentation. It results in a very good seed and a very clean seed at the end of the process. But you see down there on the very bottom, have a very small note. But is fermentation required? And the truth is no. And so this is something I've been doing personally for years. And I found other people online that do it too. So you know it has to work then. In all seriousness, this does work. Basically, I just will scoop the seeds out of a tomato, throw them on a paper towel or on a paper plate, and just allow the seeds to dry down completely. That's all I do. I don't ferment them. I don't wash them. I don't rinse them. When I go to plant them the next year, I scrape or peel them off the paper plate or the paper towel, and they grow fine without any problem. And so there is one caveat to this, and that's the seeds aren't pretty, because basically the little gel sacs that are around the seed, they dry down and they look a little crusty and funky. So if you were going to swap seeds with folks or do things like that, you might want nice, pretty, clean seeds and not crusty seeds like this would produce. It doesn't hurt their ability to germinate in any way to have crusty seeds, but certainly they're not as nice to look at. So with that one caveat to this method, I think non-fermenting tomato seeds actually saves us a little bit of time and effort. And so you can make your own call on what's most appropriate for your tomato seed saving efforts. So there are some things to understand about seeds and what we do with them. So first off, we do want to make sure that seeds are properly dried down and fully and completely dried down. So basically my rule of thumb is if I think they're done drying, I wait a few more days because I want to make sure that the moisture level is down. And certainly there are moisture meters and things like that we can buy. We really don't need it. Very large seeds like pumpkin seeds and things like that, we can actually crack them and things like that. But generally speaking, whenever you think they're dry, give them a few more days and they probably for certainly are. Seeds actually are living. They're actually respiring. So what happens when we have seed that are old and they don't germinate? Most of the time they have actually run out of energy reserves because seed are living and they're actually burning through their energy reserves while we're waiting to plant them. So any way we can slow down that respiration, that burning of that stored energy, means they have more energy to germinate for longer. So what we can do is place them in the freezer or refrigerator. Generally, I put them in the freezer. If you look at any of the world seed banks around for any species, they all are freezing seeds at extremely low temperatures, lower than we can do in the home freezer. But the principle's the same. By lowering the temperature on that seed, you're slowing that respiration. And so its ability to germinate lasts for much longer. True story, a couple of years ago, my mom was planting some tomato seeds for transplants for the garden. And she's like, I need to get some more seed. I ran out of, I think it was Orange Glow tomato or something. I said, how old were those seeds you were planting? And the particular packet she was planting from was like 10 or 12 years old. And so every year after she got done planting the few plants she wanted of that particular tomato, they just go back in the freezer. I generally like to keep seeds either in a plastic jar or box. Glass works just as well, but plastic, if I knock it out of the freezer, then I'm not as likely to have a broken jar in my hand. So I happen to like plastic. What you do want to do if you have them in a container like that is allow the container itself to warm up to room temperature before you remove seeds from it. And what happens if we open up a cold container, we can have condensation happening on the inside, and we don't want condensation or water to reach those dry seeds that are in there. So generally speaking, you can bring it out in spring, let it warm up to room temperature, pull out the seeds you'll think you'll use, and then put it back in the freezer. So it slows you down a little bit that you don't immediately open it, but it's not too critical of it. I think it's worthwhile to take that step and delay yourself. So a really big seed tip is to label everything. If it can be labeled, put a label on it. You will not remember what something is, and you'll have things and you'll be staring at them, and you may know it's tomato, but you won't have any idea which tomato it was. So that's one reason why I like using paper towels to put tomato seeds on. I can just take a Sharpie and write on the paper towel exactly what it is. And so then I don't have to worry about a label falling off or anything like that. But certainly label more than you think you would want to or need to, and you will be happy you did, because none of us are going to remember everything. If you do, let me know your secret, because there's a lot of people that need help in that area, including myself. So this is a really good resource if you want to read more about saving seed. It is written, I would say, a little more towards a farmer's scale, but the information in it is spot on for gardeners, and it's a great resource. So you can actually access the resource document by that QR code or by the URL there. I do need to update it because I did realize just before I hopped on, I have a list of general gardening resources associated with the seed saving ones, and I haven't updated that list probably in 2 years on this particular document. So some of those are going to be dead links, but the seed saving resources on the document you can pull up right now are absolutely correct, and they shouldn't be dead. I'll double check it before I send it out tomorrow, but just be aware I will send you an updating form that you can still access through this address. I'll just load up the new form to that address. So you will be getting this. That particular seed saving guide is an excellent resource. There's great books too. So don't forego stopping at your local library or browsing online, because certainly there are some good seed saving books out there. So, few tips before we go. Number one, if you have a very rare or sentimental variety where you are the only one that has it, or or whatever, if it's important to you, never plant all the seed in one season, because that's going to be the season that the groundhog comes into the garden and eats every tomato in the row. And so we don't want to lose seed varieties. We've lost enough over the years as it is. So always have some in reserve so that if the worst happens, the garden gets flooded, whatever, we have the ability to grow that again. Be prepared to rogue off types that show up in your plants. And what I mean by that is if you are saving seed and you have the orange tomato that pops up that should be red, if we're looking at seed purity and maintaining true to type, we really should pull that plant out. We should rogue it out. That's what rogue means, is basically to pull them out and get rid of them. The other option is we take it as, hey, what just happened? Let's see if this is any good. And so you actually look at developing it. So kind of isolating it and keep growing it to see, is this orange version of my red tomato better for some reason? Either way is correct, but if we're really looking at keeping true to type, we do need to be prepared to rogue off types. So if we're growing bush beans, then we're saving seed from it, and we suddenly have a plant that's really pushing out runners really strong, pull that plant out, or at least don't save seed from it, because we know that's not true to the type. It's not what we should be expecting. Again, it could be a happy cross-pollination that happened and we like the results, but just understand that that is a drift or a movement in that genetic base that might not be appropriate. And again, I also like to encourage you, when it comes to those sentimental or important varieties, keep multiple years and actually keep them labeled in reserve. Because when we grow something this year and there's an off type happening, it could have happened last year, but it could have happened a couple of years earlier. Because again, because we don't see everything in genetics automatically, we could have a contamination event that happened some distance back. So if we can go back 5 years and pull out grandpa's tomato, we might be able to avoid that contamination that turned that red tomato yellow, for instance. So just keep that in mind. Having multiple generations in reserve is not a bad idea if we're talking about wanting to preserve a variety in a more serious or particular manner. With that, we are going to stop with and pause for questions.